are you, Ben? How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm in the middle of a road trip right now, traveling through um, the west coast of California. And so just trying to figure out how to work and travel at the same time is a really interesting balance. So it is very practical though, because I was hungry. I was at Starbucks stealing their Wi-Fi. And then I needed to make lunch, and I'm vegan, and Starbucks has no vegan options. So I had my kitchen in the parking lot, and now I just made some food. So life is good.
That is very convenient. So my first question for you is, in your art, you tend to take the ordinary and make it into something extraordinary. Do you think that is what is lacking from human society, that people find it hard to see the extraordinary in the ordinary?
Mm. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's something that everyone struggles with, where routine and like human nature is such that the minute you have something, it's no longer special.
Yeah.
That's why we kind of buy new things all the time, even if we don't need them, because we want that excitement and novelty. And then suddenly, within a few days, it's no longer new, so it's no longer special. I think this is kind of just a, a pillar of human nature. And I think there's just an affinity towards creating or to gravitate towards things that are new and different and interesting. I don't know if it's good for us, but I think we definitely gravitate towards it as a society.
Do you think due to us gravitating towards the new and trying to find that new special thing, that's what's causing half the problem with pollution of different, the clothing industry and then also plastics, but just in general, the overall pollution consumption of humans?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we live in a disposable, consumable culture. Um, even if it's not about buying things, even the pursuit of experiences or travel, like I'm doing right now, are things that consume a lot of resources. If we were just satisfied with what we had, then we wouldn't be doing any of this. But to play devil's advocate, I think a lot of the biggest human innovations are also a byproduct of that same hunger. And so whether or not we take human nature and we make it into a net positive versus taking it and making it into a net negative is truly up to us to figure out like how we want to handle the situation. So I don't think it's an excuse, basically, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. So if you were to create an artwork that had to portray anthropogenic human-induced climate change, do you have any ideas where you would start with that?
So the way I think about art isn't about like I need to create something because I want to will it into existence. I tend to think about what kind of problem can I solve. So I take the approach of a designer more than that of an artist. And so very much I would, if you asked me, if you were a client and you said, hey, could you please design a piece of anthropogenic art? I would ask you, well, why do you want to design it? Who is the intended audience? What do you hope to accomplish with it? Where will it be displayed? How will people interact with it? What do you hope, how are you going to measure success? And so like, I have a lot of questions when it comes to like the creation of stuff that I like to ask. And it's like by asking all of these questions that actually start informing the creation process, the creation output, and the creation itself. So for me, the first step is always asking a lot of questions. And so no, I don't have a readily available idea that I would love to will into existence just yet.
So good. So you often share the behind the scenes of your shoots. Do you think the media does enough to share the behind the scenes stories of the damage that is done due to the global environment?
I mean, I think it's shared. I just don't think it always performs well. In some ways, I think what we've maybe done wrong with news in general and the way information spreads is like we cater towards human needs as opposed to what we need to see. So let me explain that. So I think that the purpose of good art is to help shift perspectives, right? When you create art, it kind of makes you slightly uncomfortable, and ideally it comes with a sense of curiosity and cool so that it offsets the uncomfortable and then it spreads and goes, and then people can start like opening Pandora's box and learning a little bit more. And so that sense of like when art is able to ignite a sense of curiosity and ask and get people to ask themselves questions and challenge the way they think, that's when I think art is successful. When it comes to news and news cycles and information and the way information spreads, those aren't the metrics that we use to measure success. The metrics we use is how many clicks did it generate, how many shares did it get, how long did people spend reading it. And so very much what we're optimizing for is something that is click-worthy. And it's been shown scientifically that the things that people are most likely to click through are the negative, outrageous, disgusting things. And sometimes we show the behind the scenes of destruction, and that makes us go like, ah, this is horrible. How could they? And then we move on with our day, and because it stops there. And so I think that, part of the way information spreads need to happen a little bit more of is, I think it just needs to be more balanced. And it's one thing to just say like, oh, the world is broken. Let's burn it down. It needs to be fixed. And it's another to say like, well, what can I do about it in an everyday basis? Because ultimately, we are not going to burn down the system. It just doesn't, rarely, if ever, happens. And so ultimately, it's up to us to kind of be accountable to our own role and our own responsibility in the ecosystem. So to make that very practical, in my world, I create work that is, that focuses disproportionately on the problem. And so while I do take a lot of time thinking about what the call to actions are, I focus very much on the problem and not the solutions. And I believe that artists have this unique ability to envision something that doesn't yet exist in the world, and that we have enough threat-based narratives, enough negative stories out in the world that it would be kind of cool if artists started telling more hope-based narratives. Like what would the world look like if we solved all these different problems? And then if we had something to work towards, maybe we'd stop running away from our problems. And I just think that there's something there. And so personally, I'm looking at shifting my own art practice from the problem space into the solution space as a result. But as you can see, I'm not waiting for the world to change, because that is a losing battle. So I think you just have to do what you can with what you have and start there, and keep fighting for it. And I don't think there's any right or wrong. There are just a whole bunch of different strategies, and some of them will work, some of them won't work, some of them will work for you, some of them won't work for others, and that's just the way it is.
I think you're right. I think the media does fluctuate us with negative news, and that seems to be the thing that gets the hits. For example, the IPCC report was very popular for about 2 days, and then it dwindled from everyone's minds. And I think
Yeah.
you're right. We need some way to change that mindset. And there's movies like 2040 that Damon Gameau directed that has a list of solutions that we can do, but it doesn't seem to get the views. How do
Yeah.
we switch those mindsets so that people do watch those things and do interact with that? Because I think sometimes people get overwhelmed by the negative stories that they don't know how to act.
Yeah. I mean, you're asking like a silver bullet question, and I don't know if there's a silver bullet solution, right? Like, and I don't know if just showing people stories is the way to solve it. So like, you could distribute the film in school and make every student watch it, but like, does that make it a better story? Does that make it an effective story? Does that make it more shareable? Does that make it actionable? Like, I think you're asking a very complex question. But I think you're asking the right question, in that if we want people to take action, what kind of story do we need to tell? How do we meet people where they're at? And how do we deliver them the information in a way that can lead to action? And so as part of that sort of exploration and that narrative, you start to realize that just raising awareness isn't enough, because if you just raise awareness without providing solutions, then you're just raising frustration. And so like, how do you get people engaged? How do you invite them? What does the onboarding process look like? And once again, there are like an infinite number of ways that people are trying, and if it was easy, it would be done already. But I think that where you're at right now and the kind of questions that you're asking is the right place to start, because I think too often the problems that we have in society actually come from a lack of people asking questions. They just kind of accept things the way they are, or they're like, they have kind of these flawed hypotheses which I think at the end of the day are ego-driven, and I'm speaking from personal experience, where, for example, I used to think like, if only more people knew, then the problem would be solved. And so I was like, okay, well, I just need to create art, and it just needs to go viral. And then once it's viral, then things will change. And like, that didn't happen. And I don't think it happens that way. Because if I think of my own personal behavior, when's the last time a viral video I watched like changed my view on the world? Like, I don't know. If it happened, it probably happened once.
Yeah.
So it's like you can't think of change as binary in that way. And I think it's just important to ask the difficult questions and not accept the easy answers.
Yeah, definitely. So my next question for you is the problem that exists in the world at the moment seems to be the human disconnection from the natural environment, as we were just talking about. The very environment we all depend on. Do you have this in mind when you are creating your art?
Mm. Well, I think that's one problem. So I'm an interesting environmentalist, I think, because I don't actually love nature that much. I'm very much a city person, and I like air conditioning, and I don't like camping, and I'm not a big outdoor person. But at the same time, as you just said, we all live on spaceship Earth, and there's a finite amount of resources and an infinite number of generations that are going to come after us, and so it's like obviously unsustainable if we just keep burning through our resources, right? Like if you I don't know, had a pack of cereal and never filled it up, it would run out eventually. That's just the way it is. It's very simple. And so to me, the reason I'm in this battle is I think there's a sense of duty and morality into it. But then paired with that is a sense of privilege. Like I have the privilege to care about something greater than myself, where other people are maybe just trying to pay for their bills, as an example, and just trying to make it through school, or just trying to like make sure their kids are fed. And and so I think there are a lot of competing priorities in life, and that's what makes it so difficult. Is that while the environmentalists might argue that if the world dies, everything dies with it. People aren't looking at that long time horizon. They're just looking at the next week, the next month, the next year, and that kind of the priorities that are determined based on time, I think, are what no one. It's not that people are dumb or that they don't care. It's that they have other priorities. So for me, I think that we need to stop thinking of it as us versus them and maybe look at it more as an ecosystem. So if we took the 17 different SDGs as an example, we think of them as individual buckets. You'll see companies say like, oh, we focus on like 2, 4, 7, and the rest is like not our priority. But like you can't think of it that way. Like our existence on this planet has positive in some aspects and negative on others aspects. And so really what we're gunning for is like a net positive and, on all respects. You want to have a net positive effect on society and have a net positive effect on the environment. So how are you trying every day to be better? How are you trying every day to like not forget about the fact that we all depend on each other and we all depend on this planet? And so I think our thinking, once again, and this is probably a failure of our human condition, is that we like simple solutions to complex problems, and we're always looking for these silver bullets. And we have a hard time kind of empathizing with like why are solutions not happening quicker. So for me, I think the biggest thing that we can fight against, I think the common enemy is apathy. And I think this is true of any wealth class, of any demographic, is like if we can get people to care, and if they just start caring about something, they'll eventually start caring about the planet. If people start shifting away from the I to the we, or the us and the world, like that's the first step. And so we just need to start thinking about more than ourselves, and then the rest will come from there. So I think that's the first bastion.
Yeah, you mentioned within your answer that obviously everyone has different priorities, and in a world in which we are readily moving and doing things, that does tend to happen, and the environment, it tends to be on the back burner, even in politics and in government standing. How do we ensure that the environment doesn't get put on the back burner? How do we make it a priority? How would you say is the most effective way to do that?
Well, I'm an artist, so I'm not necessarily the right person to ask for this, but they say that like the things that are top of mind are the things that get resolved the first. Mm-hmm. And so one piece of that puzzle is just to make sure that it's constantly in conversation. So people might get mad, for example, as like, oh, why ban straws? Straws only account for like 0.001% of the plastic in the ocean or something. And it's true. However, if every time you see a straw, it makes you think of the environment, and you like reconnect with your small tiny actions and how they have a rolling repercussion on downstream, that is a good thing. If you stop thinking of trash as away every single time you throw the trash, so let's say you continue throwing away trash, but at the very least you're starting to think about trash every time you do it, and you're starting to feel a little bit guilty, that's like a good step. So So for me, it's about like, how do we constantly find different ways to make things be top of mind for people? Art is one way to do that. Policy is another way to do that. Businesses can get involved in that. Everyone has a role to play, and so there's no shortage of ways. I guess that's the beauty of big, colossal problems like the environment, is that they're not going away. I mean, you can literally throw a rock in any direction and start working on it, and that's totally fine. So yeah, I would say just, keep it relevant, keep it current, keep it updated, and, just keep poking away at it.
Definitely. Something else you mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is that you aren't a typical environmentalist in that you don't love nature and you don't love camping. And I think that's a
Mhm.
really unique perspective to have, as most environmentalists normally have some sort of connection to nature. Is there any particular reason that fostered your emphasis on environmental issues, considering you don't have that connection to nature?
Yeah, so I got into the environmental movement because I literally came up with an art project idea, or rather my partner came up with this idea. And she said, "Oh, Ben, why don't you use storms as a metaphor for climate change and just have ordinary people sitting in front of it? And, it would make a cool adventure, and we could take some cool photos and tell an important story." And I was like, that sounds like a wonderful idea, but I don't know very much about climate change. So I was like, well, look, what do you do when you don't know much about climate change? Well, you watch some documentaries about it. And I think like I basically went from knowing it was a problem. It's kind of like how we go through the world and we just kind of go on autopilot. You see things, but you don't really like digest them and internalize them.
Yeah.
And so because I had decided that I wanted to do a project, it gave me a reason to look. It gave me a reason to see. And I think once you see something, you can't really unsee it anymore. Once you start championing something, you can't not do it, because then you become a hypocrite. And so it's sort of, I guess I'm like a reluctant environmentalist. Like, I don't want to be an environmentalist. I just feel like I have to be an environmentalist because the world is demanding it, and I know enough about it that I now have to do something about it. But like, for others, that calling might be homelessness or poverty or social justice and so forth. And those are all equally important. And like I said, will eventually wrap back to the environment sooner or later. Um, but yeah, if yeah, the environment for me kind of was just, I guess when I was ready to start looking at it, that's when I started to care. And I think, as weird as I see myself, I don't think I'm unique. And by what I mean by that is, I think the environmental movement as a whole might have a little bit of a branding problem, right? Like when you think environmentalist, you might think white, um, younger, hippie, bottle with sticker on it, floral raven backpacks, or maybe the outdoorsy folks, or the National Geographic photographer. And then that's like, those are the environmentalists. But the truth is, I think we need to figure out how to include everyone in this representation so that everyone feels like they can be an environmentalist, and everyone should be an environmentalist to some capacity. And so, when I say like, oh, I'm not like a typical environmentalist, I guess that's what I'm referring to, is like, I'm not a typical stereotypical environmentalist that we have defined, somehow the movement has defined itself as. And I hope that also changes, because when I talk to ordinary people living in cities that have tech jobs and so forth, like, that don't necessarily love nature, also think that climate change is a problem, right? Like, so we are all in this conversation anyways.
Yeah, definitely. Do you feel the pressure to escalate your art in terms of its size and impact with each iteration?
Yes, and that's a problem, right? Like, you're like, oh, it needs to be bigger, it needs to be better, it needs to be more, and then like, oh wait, this is exactly the kind of unsustainable growth mindset that everyone else falls into. So yes, I feel the pressure. Thankfully, I am constrained by the laws of physics and the laws of the size of my wallet, and so what I want and what actually happens are often two different things. Um, I do think that the true success isn't doing the biggest possible thing individually. I think the true success, and this is something that I'm still working towards and have not been able to hack yet, but true success is when you're able to build a blueprint so that everyone else can be empowered to create their own version of the thing, right? Like truly open sourcing activism, campaigns, art, and so forth. And so if you can do that, then you've truly accomplished scalability in a way that is radically different than just being the most successful individual, right? So I think within me lie the kind of the warring factions, like the artist fighting the activist. So the artist wants to be unique and different and wants to do something that no one else can do, but the activist wants everyone to copy him so that, so that the world can be a better place. So there's this sort of like interesting duality and fight internally that happens like fairly consistently.
If you were freed from all limitations, including your wallet and physics and all that sort of stuff,
Yeah.
what would your ultimate artwork take the form of?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think there is an ultimate artwork. I think it's a process, right? So, it's not so much a destination, but a journey to constantly do better and to create things that are more impactful and more meaningful. I right now I'm actually in the process of rethinking what my art should be, and to sort of shift from the problem space to the solution space. And so actually what I would like to start working on is just using art as a medium to accelerate the welcoming of new technologies into the world. So I'm thinking of regenerative materials. I'm thinking of, kelp and seaweed and all these different cool things that are coming out of it, like vegan leather out of mushrooms and foam made from rubber. And it's like, oh, we have all these different natural alternatives that are actually really, really cool and really, really sustainable. Like, why don't I use those as building materials instead of trash, which is like, I'm really tired of trash right now. And so for me, it's kind of like, it's figuring out like the next level of saying, okay, I've talked about the problem long enough. Let's start talking about solutions. And I would like to actually be able to produce more things more frequently in a way that others can copy them. So I think that would be sort of the short-term goal of like in the next 3 years. I would like to be able to create something like that, as opposed to like one big, epic, crazy, cool thing.
So your art has taken you to many places and regions around the world.
Mm-hmm.
In the course of traveling, have you seen many impacts of environmental pollution, particularly in the developing world?
Yes, I have seen the impacts of pollution. I think, so I think that the developed world is a lot better at hiding their damage than the developing world. So like, I think that's why the developing worlds get a lot of the flack. But I don't think it's so much a question of developing versus non-developing. I think it's a question of poverty. If you go to like an Indian reservation in the United States, you're going to see just as much trash all over the streets, as you would in Southeast Asia, in a poor neighborhood. But in a rich neighborhood, like, I mean, a place like Singapore or a rich city like Shanghai, you won't see plastic and trash thrown everywhere, because pollution is directly tied to affluence. And once again, it comes to like, how much privilege do you have? And it's funny because in some places like, let's say like India, plastic is still a privilege in some rural parts. And so, if you're like super low on the food chain, you're eating out of like banana leaves and stuff. And then if you graduate, if you become like rich enough, maybe like earning $1 a day or whatever, then you can suddenly afford single-use plastics, and it's fantastic. Now everything's clean and sterile. And it's like, whoa, this is really weird. And so I don't know. It's like, I think it's not helpful to like finger point, because at the same time, so like while the developing countries are more polluted, so more plastic flows into the ocean from those places. As an example, they have less laws and they have less stringent regulations. The Western countries are also driving a lot of that. And so what I mean by that is, for example, most of the trash in developing countries is collected by the informal waste economy. Like waste pickers will pick up trash off the streets because they don't have like central collection services. And so these people are able to like separate these plastics into like these 15 different categories, and they'll trade that for money. So some might say that's a problem because it's like indentured servitude, but others are happy because it actually represents jobs. But then at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who's picking things up. If you have things like sachets or plastic bags that have zero value, then nobody's picking it up. And so, who's driving that recycled demand? Who should be driving that recycled demand? Who should be designing better systems so that they can actually be more easily collected? And this is the same of like, of these, I don't know, clothing factories that are building clothes for the brands that we wear, regardless of how big. It's like, wait, don't we have a responsibility to continue regulating downstream? Don't we have the responsibility of regulating downstream to like the mining companies and their mining practices too? And so on and so forth. And so, you know, there is this sort of perpetuation of the problem because every single time you you know one there every single time there's a middleman along the way, they need to make profit. And so by the end of it, when you look at the raw materials phase of it, like the people that are getting screwed over. And so once again, it's a scarcity problem. It's a greed problem. It's the way our society is designed that I think is just really tough. So yeah, so that being said, I mentioned earlier that like the enemy is apathy. I think it's very easy to look at these problems and say, the world is screwed, da da da. But it's also important to, I think, also like look at the progress that we've made, right? Like as a society, we have less people dying. We have, the world is objectively getting better year after year, most years, since like the 50s, right? Or since way before that. And so some part of us needs to hold faith that change is possible. And we also need to be willing to work towards what that change looks like. So it's kind of it's always a balance. It's a little hard.
Yeah, definitely. So my last question for you is, you've lit a person on fire, tied people up underwater, made people run along the sides of skyscrapers. You can obviously get people to trust you, and I'm going to assume building trust is important to you. Is developing trust part of the solution in battling against things like the climate crisis and plastic pollution?
I mean, I think the obvious answer is yes, because nothing in the world works without trust. Well, actually, that's not true. I guess that's why we have contracts, legal contracts and divorce lawyers, because trust isn't enough. But I do think that a certain amount of trust in general makes the world go around. I think maybe the more, so we can say, I guess to make it personally relevant, like what can I do with this information that trust is important? I think in order to lead happier, more fulfilled lives with hope and possibility, we can assume that the people on the opposite side of the battle actually want the same thing as us. And if only we could find a way to reach them in the right way, with the right words, with the right language, with the right structure, then we can find a solution. And I think having a framework of trust in the way we interact with people, rather than saying these people are just greedy bastards that are trying to ruin the world at their own expense and they don't really they don't care about anyone else, da da da. I think that's a less helpful framework. And so that's how I would, I guess, redirect that question and make it like immediately applicable, because you can't control how other people show up in this world, but you can control how you show up in the world. And I think if you approach the world with trust and curiosity, it'll be reciprocated back to you. And if you do the reverse and you assume the worst of intentions with everyone you interact with, you're probably going to have a very, very hard time getting anything done. So that's my 2 cents. But I see myself as an artist who lives on the intersection of worlds, meaning I talk to people on all sides from all backgrounds. And so I have to have that perspective.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you so much, Ben, for doing
Yeah.
this interview with me. I think you provide
Thank
such
you.
a unique perspective, and I think that that's really valuable. So thank you so much.
You asked great questions. Good job on the research.
No problem. I'll see you later.
All right. All the best. Good luck with everything.
Have a
Bye.
good day.
Bye.